So as I mentioned, thank you for the nice introduction. It's my great honor to be able to share some of my early work on time perception in this opportunity at Consciousness Club Tokyo. So if you don't mind, I would like to briefly insert kind of a plug advertisement for the research center that I work for. So I'm a project research assistant at International Research Center for Neurointelligence at University of Tokyo. So this is a multidisciplinary research center, which the overall aim is to understand how does human intelligence arise. So to achieve that, our center brings together researchers from multiple different domains, including labs working on development neuroscience to understand the mechanism during the critical period through animal studies. And we also have labs working on human cognition and the clinical population to understand, to solve brain development and disorders for human intelligence. And there's also labs that work on computational models for brain or neural-inspired AI. And there are also a few labs that work on advanced new technology that can help to facilitate both animal and human imaging studies. So my lab kind of work in between this domain of human, clinical, and computation. So generally, my lab's interest has kind of got broadened since my PhD time. So currently, my lab is interested in how does the brain learn what we call as generative models, or you can also call it cognitive maps for the environment. And we're interested also to build deep networks that can learn a more interpretable generative model for visual scenes, just like how a baby can do. And we are also interested in applying computational models to understand psychiatric disorders from both behavior and neuroimaging. And as I mentioned, I also develop algorithms for fMRI analysis. One domain that I initially worked on in my research career is time perception. And the reason I chose this last topic is because I think this may be slightly more related to consciousness, and hopefully I could bring some inspiration and interesting discussion on after the talk. So first question is, why is time important? As you can see from this figure, for animals, being able to accurately time its action is important for this frog to get food, or for this insect to escape from predator. And in our daily life, if you happen to drive, then in certain countries, it's okay to keep driving where the light is yellow. But if you really want to do this, then you need to estimate how long the light has turned yellow and what's the typical duration for yellow light. And then not to mention that when we enjoy music, the rhythm arises because each tone can last for a variable duration, and they combine in a nice way. And even during daily conversation, we know that many words are distinguished only by how long the word lasts. For example, the word sheep and sheep, we can easily distinguish them purely based on how long the E or E lasts. Right, so it seems that we can perform many tasks related to time in kind of effortless way, but the mechanism of time perception is still not fully understood in the brain. And more interestingly, so in the domain of time perception, we have found that our subjective feeling of time is in fact not always accurate, and it can in fact be distorted by various factors. So I would like to first show a small demo, although I don't know how well it will work on internet, but I will still give it a try. So in this demo, you're going to first see a cross in the middle, and you can just stare at the cross. And then I'm going to display two kind of flickering stimuli, one after another. And here you can just judge for yourself which one lasts longer. And I'll play it now. And I can play again in case you didn't catch it. Right, so I don't know how do you feel in your mind, or whether you can watch it well on your computer, but basically what I showed you was two flickering stimuli. One is drifting at a lower speed, the other one is drifting at a higher speed. And typically, so even though these two stimuli are of exactly the same duration physically, typically most of people will feel that the stimulus that kind of drifted with a faster speed actually is perceived as it lasts longer to them. And this phenomenon, interestingly, was actually first identified by Ryota Kainai, who I think is the founder of Consciousness Club Tokyo. So what he found was that the temporal frequency of a stimulus can influence our subject feeling of time. So the higher frequency of a stimulus change, then the more you're going to overestimate the duration. And this phenomenon applies to a wide range of different physical duration. And in addition to temporal frequency, there are also many other factors that can bias our subject feeling of how long a period of time lasts. For example, the numerosity of stimuli, the size, and the luminance or contrast of stimulus can all bias our stimulus. Generally, these stimuli that are of higher magnitude tend to perceive as slightly longer than those stimuli of lower, smaller magnitude in each of these domains. And our perception of time can also depend on the history of stimulus we see. So Peter C. actually first found that if people watch a stimulus present to them repeatedly, and suddenly some novel stimulus, let's say this grid disk, displays them, which we can call them as oddball, then people tend to feel this oddball lasts longer than this repeated stimuli. And an alternative hypothesis is that this phenomenon was due to a neural phenomenon called repetition suppression, which means when the stimulus is repeatedly displayed, the neural response to the same stimulus tends to decrease. So if the time perception depends on the magnitude of the neural response, then that can actually quite coincident with this phenomenon. And I went on to investigate this phenomenon to understand whether this distortion of duration due to repetition or is it due to just purely surprise? Like is it true that anything that's surprise or unexpected, like this oddball, will be perceived longer, or only repetition of stimulus itself can make us feel that the stimulus lasts shorter? And it turns out that the repetition of stimulus itself is a major factor that can explain this phenomenon, and the expectation cannot explain this distortion. So that tells us that the perception of time might arise quite early in the sensory cortex, because this repetition suppression phenomenon is kind of quite strong in early visual cortex. And so after you see all these phenomena, you might come up with a question, okay, so how time perception can be influenced by so many kind of factors, sensory factors of stimuli. But in our daily life, we are simultaneously faced with so many different objects or stimuli with different properties, and each of them might give us different clue of how long the time lasts. So some of them might bias our estimation of time towards longer. Some of them may individually tell us that time is shorter. But how does the brain actually form a coherent feeling of how long the time lasts when we are faced with so many sensory stimuli that can individually bias towards a different direction? So the first study I'm going to introduce tries to answer this question. And to answer that, we took an inspiration from Dr. Kanai's finding that our subject feeling of a duration can be impacted by the temporal frequency of stimulus, because this is actually a very strong phenomenon. I will show it later. So if you display a stimulus of either low frequency or high frequency to participants, then even though the physical duration is the same, we tend to perceive a high frequency stimulus as lasting longer. So how do we come up with a feeling of how long the time lasts when we are faced with objects? Some of them move faster, some of them move slower. So kind of mimic that in a lab environment, we can display two stimuli simultaneously, one with a higher frequency and one with lower frequency. And then we try to understand how does the brain calculate the subject duration by combining potentially cues from this individual stimuli. So to test that, we first, of course, we found to first confirm that this subjective duration distortion indeed occurred. So this is baseline experiment in which we let participants to judge relatively which of the two stimuli lasts longer. The two stimuli are present one after another. So in this case, it happened to be that 1 Hertz is present first and 6 Hertz is present second. And across all trials, there's always one stimulus that lasts a fixed duration, which is 6 milliseconds. That means 100 milliseconds. We call them as a reference stimulus. And another stimulus will last a variable duration across different trials. So they can range from 100 milliseconds up to 1100 milliseconds. And we can plot, so these two curves corresponding to two conditions. So the red curve corresponds to the case when the reference stimulus of the fixed duration is 1 Hertz, and then the 6 Hertz, the high frequency stimulus, has a variable duration across this wide range. And as you can see, overall, participants have a much higher chance of judging the 6 Hertz stimulus as longer than the 1 Hertz stimulus, which confirms the finding that high frequency stimulus tend to be judged longer. And I guess you can already know that this blue curve corresponds to the other condition, where the reference stimulus is 6 Hertz, and now the comparison stimulus is 1 Hertz. So now the comparison stimulus, which is a lower frequency, tend to be more often judged as shorter. So this curve shifts to the right, indicating that 6 Hertz is not perceived longer than 1 Hertz. So how do we quantify how much our subject duration is elongated by the temporal frequency? Then we can actually feed a psychometric curve, which often is a sigmoid curve, to this data and estimate the threshold by which participants have a 50% of chance judging the duration as either longer or shorter. Which means if a 6 Hertz stimulus has this duration, let's say 400 milliseconds, a participant cannot distinguish whether it's longer or shorter than a 600 millisecond duration of lower frequency. Then we can divide this 600 milliseconds of the reference stimulus by the threshold of the psychometric curve, and that comes with a quantity which we can call as duration distortion ratio. So when we compare high frequency versus low frequency, the duration distortion ratio is almost 1.5, which means the 6 Hertz stimulus is perceived almost one half more longer than low frequency stimulus, which is quite strong phenomenon over all different illusions of time perception. So now we can utilize these phenomena and display two stimuli together. So they appear and disappear simultaneously, which give you a cue that they should correspond to the same duration, even though individually they might give you a different clue how long the time might last. And this type of combined stimulus would make it the first one. And second stimulus could be either the low frequency or high frequency, or again, combined stimulus. And we can vary their duration and measure the psychometric curve to test different hypotheses of how the brain can form a representation of duration for this type of combined stimuli. So now we can think of what possible hypothesis can we come up with. Right? So the first hypothesis is what we call as global summing. It comes from the observation that many of the phenomena observed in time perception, that the stimulus that turn to be perceived longer also are the stimulus that usually elicit higher neural response magnitude. For example, we know that in the visual cortex, the response to high frequency stimulus, flickering stimulus, tend to be actually larger than response to low frequency stimulus. So it coincides with this distortion in time perception. So if time perception indeed depends on kind of the total neural activity in response to stimuli, then if we display two stimuli, maybe the brain can kind of look at the global neural response, which should be larger than the neural response to each individual stimuli. Then if we take some, then the perceived duration should be longer. Although it sounds kind of surprising, but following this prediction, it's a natural hypothesis. And in this case, the perceived duration should be longer than either of the single stimulus. The second hypothesis is what we call as weighted average. So in this case, the brain might be able to combine the two cues for duration by performing a weighted average. Depending on the weights, the duration estimation might be biased more towards one or the other. But in general, it should be perceived shorter than the longer duration and longer than shorter duration. So in general, you should feel that this double stimuli is lasting shorter than a single high frequency flickering stimulus, and longer than a single low frequency stimulus. And a third alternative is maybe the brain perform kind of random attention to one of the stimulus, right? So across trials, sometimes the brain happen to attend to high frequency stimulus more, and then the judgment will rely on these high frequency stimulus. But maybe in other trials, the brain will happen to pay attention to low frequency stimulus, then the judgment will depend on the subject estimation for the low frequency bar. So on average, again, this will also predict that the combined stimulus will be on average shorter than the high frequency stimulus, just because you can randomly switching between the two, and longer than the low frequency stimulus. So in this sense, they might maybe make similar prediction. So third hypothesis is, the first hypothesis is, which is also plausible, is that the brain might be kind of flexible enough that it can keep the representation of duration for each individual stimuli without kind of mandatory combination, which means I can tell how long each stimulus lasts. I don't have to really form a coherent fitting of overall duration. Then depends on what I see next. If I see the 6 Hz stimulus, then I can use the most relevant representation, say the one corresponding to 6 Hz, to make the comparison. And if I see a 1 Hz at the second stimulus, then I can use the representation for the 1 Hz to make my judgment. So in this case, you will also make a different prediction that relatively this type of stimulus will not be judged longer or shorter than either the H or L condition, because the brain can select the right representation to make judgment. So here is kind of quantitatively qualitatively what the different model will predict. So the global summing hypothesis will predict that compared to the condition where we are comparing a double stimulus against double stimulus, a low frequency or high frequency stimulus will be judged as lasting shorter than the double stimulus, as shown here. And both weighted average and the selection model will predict that high condition will be judged longer and low condition will be judged shorter. And separate representation hypothesis will suggest that there will be no difference across 3 conditions. And then we can look at how the result come out. It turns out at least the result is consistent with the prediction in the middle, that the 3 curves separate, and the curve sitting in the middle is a condition where the second stimulus is high-low and the first stimulus is also high-low. So there's no bias when participant makes this type of comparison. And if the second one is a high frequency stimulus, we tend to judge them as longer. And if the second one is low frequency, then we judge them as shorter. And this pattern is consistent with second row, although there might be some bias for this particular case, which we don't try to address in this study. There may be some other mechanism to give rise to this residual bias. So now with this phenomenon, we can rule out the first and last hypothesis. Now the option that are left is, does the brain perform weighted average or can only selectively attend to one stimulus at a time? So even though in terms of the magnitude of perceived duration, they make similar prediction, but in terms of variability of duration estimation, they can make quite different predictions, which we'll see in here as the next slides. So we can think about the first case of weighted average model. So let's say we display participants with 2 stimuli of some ground truth physical duration. And subjectively, we have some estimation of the duration for the low frequency stimulus and high frequency stimulus. The higher one might be longer than the lower one. And then we perform a weighted average to calculate a global estimation, should be somewhere in between. But because this neural system is noisy, so across trials, our subject local estimation should also vary following some distribution. So this could cause the global estimation to also follow a distribution, and we can accurately predict what is going to be the variation of this distribution. And it turns out that the variation of your global estimation depends on the weight that you put on each individual stimulus. So if you put more weights to high frequency stimulus, not only the magnitude of duration is estimated longer, but the variance is also big. And as you gradually change the weight, the variance would first decrease and then increase again. So if we plot this relation, we'll see, let's say we use a red dot to correspond to the standard deviation of the noisy sensory estimation for the high frequency stimulus duration, and the blue one corresponding to the low frequency stimulus. It corresponds to the standard deviation of this distribution. Then the standard deviation of this global estimation will follow this curve depending on how much weight you put on individual stimulus. And if you look at this curve, there is one kind of sweet spot where you can get the lowest standard deviation, which corresponding to basically Bayesian inference, right? So if the brain is really optimal, then you can find the correct way that can give rise to the most accurate duration estimation. So we are also interested in if the brain is able to do kind of weighted average, then that's a weight corresponding to an ideal observer that can minimize the variability in its time duration estimation. Now, if we follow the hypothesis of random selection, the prediction will be different. So even though in locally, they both, our subject estimation for both duration could vary, but because we can only randomly attend to one of them, across trials, the global estimation will be a mixture of two Gaussian distributions, and which will be shown like here. And you can see that this distribution become wider than the individual distribution. And if you quantitatively make prediction, you will see that the standard deviation of the global estimation will be larger than the smaller one of the standard deviation between the two conditions. So now the weighted average model and random selection model will make different predictions following these different curves. That can allow us to make a qualitative comparison against behavior data. So how do we measure that? Well, the variability of how you estimate the duration can turn into the slope of psychometric curve, right? So if we are more noisy, then the slope of the psychometric curve will be shallower. Then we can estimate a quantity called just noticeable difference to quantify how shallow is this psychometric curve, and to use that as a proximate of how variable we estimate duration. And we can estimate this for each curve. Now, these different models can make different predictions, as we mentioned. So the optimal integration model will predict that the curve will be sharper than the sharpest curve of both of these conditions, which means the just noticeable difference will be also smaller than the smaller one of either the high or low frequency condition. And the selection model will predict that the just noticeable difference will be larger than the smaller one between either the high or low frequency condition. So now we can just compare the just noticeable difference for this green curve, which is the high-low condition, compared to the smaller just noticeable difference of either the high or low condition for each participant, and see whether this conform to either prediction. And it comes out that it doesn't provide evidence again for either of the model, because the optimal integration model will suggest that all the dots should be kind of below this diagonal curve, and the selection model, random selection model, suggests it should be kind of above this diagonal curve, but we don't see that. But then we can, and now we can look at the weighted average model. So it predicts that the standard deviation of the HL condition should be larger than this the black curve. So it should predict that the standard deviation of the HL condition should be smaller than the larger standard deviation of H and L condition. Sorry, it sounds like a bit kind of too many words, but I hope you get just like this curve should in general be lower than the highest point of either high or low condition. And so then we see that indeed this is observed in the data, that across all the participants, almost all of them show that they make more accurate judgment for the high-low condition compared to high-low stimulus. In comparison to the noisy condition between either H and L. So sometimes participants might judge the high frequency stimulus with more noisy behavior. Some of them judge the L more noisier. But in general, if we pick the noisy one, we'll find that this pattern exactly matches this prediction. So this is a kind of only qualitative measurements for answering this question, but now we want to have more quantitative tests of different models. So in order to do that, we need to have a reliable estimation of how noisy participants are estimating the stimulus for each individual type of stimulus. So then we will include more pairs across different type of stimuli. And we also randomize the order of experiment so that in half of the trial, the fixed stimulus duration appear first, and in other trials, the variable duration stimulus appear first. And now we see the psychometric curve, at least qualitatively confirm what we found before. So this curve is almost the same pattern as we see before, and this one also indicates that when you compare a high frequency stimulus against a low frequency one, we indeed judge the high frequency as lasting longer. So now we can try to come up with a more quantitative model to build a model to describe how within the brain, what type of computation is performed to make the judgment. So from the participant's perspective, we assume that participants kind of form this generative model that they assume that when in any given trial, there will be some true duration corresponding to the first stimulus and second stimulus, but the true duration is not known to them. And within the brain, there will be some sensory observation or estimation of how long this time lasts. And this can arise based on some computation on the low-level sensory neurons. Right? And we make a hypothesis that when two stimuli both are displayed, then they will give rise to different sensory estimation with different means and different variance, as indicated by these two curves. Now, the brain doesn't have access to this true duration, but it has to make judgment of that. So assume that brain taking into account of the variability of this sensor estimation, and then consider all the possibility to decide what is more likely the ground truth. Is the second stimulus more likely to be longer than the first stimulus, given on my sensory observation and my knowledge of how noisy my cortex is? And if the likelihood suggests, if the predicted likelihood suggests that the second stimulus lasts longer than the brain, then participants make a judgment that the second one is longer. So in this sense, we can model the internal process of how the brain utilizes a noisy sensory estimation to perform the final behavior judgment. And then we can build a model and specify parameters corresponding to how much duration distortion each type of stimulus give rise to, and how much noise the sensory estimation would be. And that can give a trial-by-trial estimation of how likely participants are going to make the prediction, the judgment that they made. And once we build this model, then we can take part of the data of the participants as a training data, and then fit each model against participants' training data by finding the best parameter that can maximize the global likelihood of all judgment made by participants. And all these models only differ in the mechanism by which the brain integrates these different sensory cues of duration. And then once these models are fitted, then we can use estimate parameter to make prediction for left out data, which was not used during training. This is a kind of common procedure in machine learning. And then we come up with a cross-validated model likelihood. And we can use this model likelihood to compare which model makes better prediction for left out data. So by this comparison, we see that the result indeed confirm our finding that a weighted average model has a highest likelihood. And if these bars goes to the left, that means this model are worse compared to the best model. And overall, you see that the model can provide a good prediction of the psychometric curve compared to participants' behavior. However, we also notice that in the original experiment, in this experiment, we have varied the order in which the two stimuli are displayed to the participant. So in some trials, the fixed stimulus, or fixed duration was displayed first. In some trials, the fixed duration is displayed in the second position. But if actually we group these two, the data according to the order in which two stimuli are presented, we'll find that this model actually still cannot explain the data so well, right? We actually find that the performance of participants really depends on how what order we present the stimulus. So if the reference stimulus is presented first, in general, the psychometric curve are sharper compared to when the comparison stimulus is present first. So let's say if the first stimulus can have variable duration, then participants make much noisier judgment. And once we look at literature, we find that this phenomenon is not only showing in this experiment, but also actually in quite a lot of other perceptual decision making. Now we also want to understand why this phenomenon arise. And then we found that there are two mechanisms that when they play together, they can give rise to this asymmetric behavior. The first mechanism is the possibility that the brain is able to take into account the regularity of the distribution of stimulus duration over the whole experiment. By that, what I mean is across all the trials, participants might gradually learn that in any trial, the duration of the two stimuli seem to always come from two distributions. Right? One is coming from narrow distribution corresponding to the reference stimulus, and the other one maybe come from this wider distribution corresponding to the comparison stimulus. But from the participant perspective, they don't know which one is the first. So maybe in some trials, the first stimulus is sampled from this distribution, right? So in order to make a correct judgment, then ideal observer should also take into account the both of the possible order in which these stimuli are sampled. So then we should revise this general model. So in this model, we assume that participants through the experiment learn that this stimulus duration follow this kind of distribution and takes that into account into their judgment. And we can consider alternative versions of prior that participants might learn. So the first version is kind of consistent with experiment design, that there are two distributions in each trial. Another possibility is that participants just kind of learn a mixed prior, right? So one is a narrow distribution and one is a wider one. And they just somehow learn a mixed one and assume that both stimuli come from the same distribution. And third possibility is that maybe participants just don't care about the prior, just basically only rely on sensory evidence. This one we can call it as a flat prior, which means there's no additional information from prior distribution. The second mechanism is our memory could decay during the time when we make this type of perceptual judgment. So if you think about the task, the judgment has to be made after participants see the second stimuli. So when you see the second stimulus, your memory for the first one might have decayed, which means it can become noisier and the distribution become wider. So it's possible that the brain actually kind of through lifelong learning know that our sensory, our memory for sensory evidence can actually gradually decay and takes this into its computation, into consideration in its computation. And our alternative model is that maybe there doesn't exist this memory decay and the brain doesn't take that into account. So now then we can combine factors, combine different design of models in all these three factors. The first factor is our original central question. How does the brain combine different duration cues? We test these three models. And then the second question is, do observers incorporate the prior distribution that they could learn just through the task period? And we also consider two types of prior and versus one version that doesn't consider prior. And the last is whether there's memory decay during this process of judgment. And you will see that once we do model comparison, the relative log likelihood of each model against the best model show that all the models nicely group into two clusters. So on the bottom are the worst model, and you'll see that all these models, what they have in common is they either don't assume there's memory decay, or they assume that participants don't learn some prior distribution from the experiment. And only when you combine both of these factors, either some type of prior distribution and the memory decay, then the model can perform much better. And over this better model, we find that in general, a model that incorporates double distribution for the prior performs better than the prior distribution, which assume all the stimulus come from a single distribution. And we also find that weighted average model in general is better than random selection model and even better than optimal integration model. So these tell us what the mechanism by which the brain integrates different sensory cues is by performing a weighted average of the estimation for duration for each individual stimulus. Although we find that this integration is still not optimal. But on the other hand, just through the short period of experiment, participants can learn the structure of the experiment and know that in each trial, the stimulus come from two distributions, and they can actually incorporate this prior knowledge into their judgment. And they can even incorporate the knowledge about memory decay into their judgment. And now the model can fit the behavior much better. The shaded area is what the model can predict, and the shaky curve is the participant's own behavior. So, and just recap what this tells us is that the brain can incorporate prior distribution of stimulus learned during the experiment and takes into account memory decay, and it integrates different duration cues, although suboptimally. Now, an answer question in this study is, why does the brain appear optimal in some aspect, but not optimal in other aspect, right? So, and the fact that we can take into account the prior distribution indicates that we are optimal in this level, but in the kind of more local level, when we are integrating local estimations, we seem to be suboptimal. And I think this is a question that still worth further investigation. Now, this is the kind of first topic that I would like to cover. And now I would like to switch gear to another aspect of time perception. So in the first aspect, what I have talked about is how the brain estimates how long some time lasts. Another important aspect of time is the order, which event occurs first earlier than other events. And this type of temporal order judgment actually is quite important for our daily life because they can provide clue for inferring causation. So think about the case that you walk in the forest, and let's say if every time you put your step on the ground, then you hear some noise coming from the ground because you stepped on leaves. This would be very natural, right? There's nothing surprising to you because the sensory signal comes after your own action. But let's say now occasionally you hear some sound even before you step on the ground or randomly occurring at random time. That should make you cautious because, well, is this because maybe there's some animal like snake around you? You need to be more careful, right? So that means this type of temporal judgment can let us to know what sensory events need to be pay attention. Are they caused by our own action, or are they coming from some external source that we need to pay attention to? And it turns out that interestingly, not only the temporal order judgment is important for inferring causation, there was also finding that the knowledge of causation can in turn change our subjective feeling of temporal order. So this line of research starts first from the finding of a phenomenon called intentional banding, which is discovered by Peter Haggard and others. So what they found was that if you let participants press a button, and then every time after participants press the button, you play a tone after a fixed delay. In this case, 250 milliseconds. So like press, brr, press, brr. So every time you press the button, you hear a tone. And if you adapt participant to this, and then you ask the participant to estimate when did they feel that they pressed the button, and then when did they feel that they heard a tone, by kind of watching a quickly running clock and reporting when they, let's say, when they press the button, like where is the hand of the clock. So this can reflect participants' subjective feeling of the time. And what they found is that after this type of adaptation, our subjective feeling of the time of the action actually shifted later, and our subjective feeling of the time of these sensory events was shifted earlier, such that our feeling of the interval between our motor action and the sensory feedback become shorter. This is what I call as intentional binding. So it seems that when we know that an action is caused by ourselves, then we tend to believe that this stimulus shouldn't become so late. So then we actually turn to perceive the time between the two events as shorter. And interestingly, they also find like if the motion is not caused by the participants themselves, but by say stimulating your motor cortex with transcranial magnetic stimulation, then this phenomenon is reversed. So if the action is involuntary, then subject feeling of time of the action is actually perceived earlier, and the subject feeling of time of the sound tone is actually perceived later. So this finding only kind of suggests that the subject feeling of the time between our action and sensory feedback will become shrunk if we consistently adapt to some delay of the sensory feedback. But another very interesting phenomenon that follow up on this study is more kind of striking, which means that our perception of temporal order can actually be reversed. So in this study performed by Stetson et al., they adapted participants to a consistent delay, just as was shown in the previous experiment, but also they test the condition in which the flash will come immediately after the button press. So in most of the trials in this one condition, the flash immediately come after, but in another small portion of the trials, the flash on the screen can come up either before participants make a press or after participants make a press. Then they ask the participant to judge, did the flash occur before you press button or after? Now we can again calculate a psychometric curve. So similarly for this adaptation condition, although most of trials participants adapt to this consistent delay, some of the trials the flash can occur at a random time, and we can also estimate the judgment. And it turns out that the psychometric curve has shifted after participants are adapted to 100 millisecond delay, which is quite interesting, because now if you look at the participant response to say 70 milliseconds, so in this case, even if a flash occurs 70 milliseconds after you make an action, you actually feel that it occurred before you make the action. And so adapting to this consistent delay caused our brain to reverse to shift the timeline of two domains. One domain is our sensory input, one domain is our subject action. Now the question that I wanted to answer is what neural mechanism can potentially give rise to this recalibration of our subjective order judgment. Now, to think about that, we first need to think about what the possible ways the brain might encode for intervals, right? And coincidentally, there was a finding that in the brain area called superior corticus, there's these neurons that are selectively tuned to specific intervals between sensory input in different modality. So these neurons, they can respond to auditory stimulus, no problem. They can also respond to visual stimulus, but their response to a pair of visual and audio stimuli will be higher. And this only happens if the visual and audio stimuli fall into a specific interval, right? So if for some neurons, they will fire really strong if the visual stimulus precedes audio stimulus by some interval, and in other neurons, they will fire stronger if the auditory stimulus precedes the visual stimulus. And this distribution of kind of interval tuning neuron is not only found between auditory and the visual domain, but also between somatosensory and the visual, and between auditory and somatosensory domains. So although the initial experiment was done in anesthetized animals, so we don't know whether there exist neurons that are similarly tuned to interval between your subject action and the sensory feedback, but we assume that similar neuron might also exist. And then we can come up with a simple model. In this model, we assume that there's a bank of neurons that each one is individually tuned to a preferred interval between agent's motion action and sensory events. And then in order to make a judgment of temporal order, we assume that they are high-level pooling neurons that place different incoming synaptic weights on these interval tuning neurons. So if a neuron is if group neuron is going to respond in favor of flash after action, then they should have stronger synaptic weights coming from these interval tuning neurons that are selective to positive delays. And if another group of neurons are going to respond to flash before action, then they should have a stronger weight for delay tuning neurons for negative delays. Now, this allows a simple mechanism to judge temporal order, but how does recalibration occur? Then we can take into account another known phenomenon in the brain, which is called synaptic scaling. And what it says is that if a neuron consistently fire too much because input neuron they're too much excited in input, then this neuron will going to globally scale down its synaptic weights, as shown in this red curve from its original weights of the blue curve. And if vice versa, a neuron that doesn't fire enough, and then it will globally scale up its synaptic weights in order to kind of to make its response to achieve some homeostasis level. This phenomenon has been found in various parts of the brain, and we can show that by this simple synaptic scaling mechanism, we can also explain predict the behavior of this subject recalibration of temporal order judgment. And we can fit the model to the behavior, and it can very nicely predict the phenomenon that the size of that adaptation also depends on what delays you adapt participant to. And what's more interesting is if we use the parameter that is estimated in this data set, that can actually make accurate predictions for an independent data sets with different design, which I'll show next. So now if you accept the assumption that synaptic scaling can give rise to recalibration, then the size of adaptation should depend on how much we adapt participants to, right? So in this task, we design a new task that participants need to move their cursor onto a target on every trial and click on the target. So in most of trials, we adapt participants to a delay both when they move the cursor and when the flash occur. But in some trials, the flash can be either before or after the click button. So these are the test trials in which we measure the subject judgment of timing. So we first adapt participants to many trials with a consistent delay, and then before every test, we can readapt them with a variable number of trials. And we can follow the prediction of our model. The more readaptation participants experience, then the larger the adaptation size would occur in this test condition, in this test chart. And so this is just showing that we can show the stimulus both before and after the button press. And we can see indeed, as we increase the number of readapting trials, right, from 0 to up to 4 to 6, then the size of adaptation also increase. And this model actually nicely predicts this human behavior, which is not significantly different, using the same parameter that was fitted to an independent data set. And another prediction that we can come up with this model is that if this recalibration comes from adjusting synaptic weights instead of maybe kind of fatigue of those neurons that are tuned to a particular interval, then that means this learned recalibration can be stored in the brain because the synaptic weights can keep at the same level if there's no new sensory input, right? But if this phenomenon only comes from neural fatigue, then the fatigue will gradually bounce back, and then you wouldn't see a phenomenon called storage By this storage, I'm referring to a kind of ancient finding in other aspects of after effect. So in the domain of spatial perception, we know that there's well-known phenomenon called motion after effect. So if you continually watch a waterfall, and now you shift your gaze to a rock, you'll feel that the rock seems to appear moving upward. And this phenomenon can last for a few seconds, as measured here, that can roughly last for 10 seconds. But what is interesting is that if during these 10 seconds, instead of testing participants, do they still have this after effect, we let participants stay in dark. So meaning there's no sensory input. Then we restart testing, do they still have this after effect? Then this early paper found that actually these after effects still exist, even after participants stay in dark for the same period where the motion after effect might decay. So this suggests that during this time when participants are in darkness, this motion after effect actually is stored in the synaptic weights. And we go on to test whether this temporal adaptation can also be stored. So we designed these tasks that are composed of interleaved blocks. So in each block, there's one single test trial after a few adaptation trials. So in these adaptation trials, we either adapt to a longer delay or show the splash immediately. But in half of the blocks, the test trial occur after like 8 seconds of waiting period. So in this time, participants just we ask them to silently watch the blank screen without moving their mouse and without doing anything. And then we want to see whether the recalibration to temporal auto judgment still occur after this waiting period. And we actually found that regardless of whether you test participants immediately after adaptation or wait after 8 seconds, the size of adaptation does not decrease significantly. And this storage of recalibration can even occur after 16 seconds. So in general, what this story tells us is that our brain can flexibly adapt to changes of the statistics in the timing, in the sensory timing in the environment. So why is this important? Because actually our brain's response to sensory input can vary quite a lot depending on the environment. If you stay in a dark room, actually your perceptual response to a stimulus will be kind of slower than if you stay in a bright room. So even in daily life, as you walk between darker and a brighter room, this type of sensory adaptation might occur quite frequently, even without our awareness. And we propose a simple opponent pooling model together with synaptic scaling to account for this. And we even found that similar to spatial perception of motion, we find a very similar phenomenon of storage of this adaptation. And in fact, this model, we can also use it to predict motion after effect. So this suggests that maybe when we are perceiving time and space, we might use actually quite a similar mechanism to let the brain adapt to changes in environment in order to make better judgment and perception. So overall, with these two studies, what I want to show is that the brain can quickly learn the statistics and the regularity of the statistics of the stimulus timing in the environment, and it can incorporate these statistics into its judgment of time. And we have built both high-level Bayesian models and low-level neural models to explain different type of illusions. So in my lab, the first type of model is kind of currently more of my favorite because it allows you to make more detailed predictions of people's behavior on a trial-by-trial basis, and allows you to nicely tease apart different models of how the brain might perform computation internally to perceive the world or to make decisions and learn from the world. So this work was done in my PhD training during with David Eagleman and Professor Weijie Ma. And with that, I would like to thank you everyone for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much for the great example in combining, so you start with the experimental work and you also combine with the computational model to test the hypothesis, which is might be the case for the experimental evidence. I think it's quite strong. How can I say? The examples that you showed to us. So yeah. So we can now have our questions. So anyone, you can also ask directly from Zoom, or you can post through the Slido. Yeah, maybe I'll first go the questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, so regarding the first, sorry, maybe I put my video on too. Yeah, first study you showed or perceptions, like basically combining two priors into the taking consider those things. I was wondering it's in daily life we have multiple stimuli around us.
Yeah.
So I would assume that if we attending to some of the stimuli, we suppress somehow some stimuli, and like we averaged like prior summation could be selective to those kind of attentive stimuli. I'm not so sure that kind of studies have been done, or what's your opinion about it? So
yeah, I think so. So I think that's a very good question. So although in this study we found that people kind of use different weights for these different stimuli, but the question that we haven't answered is what determines these weights. Apparently, they are not determined by the noisiness of the sensory estimation, right? Because if it depends on the noisiness, then it's kind of Bayesian inference. But in this aspect, it's not so much Bayesian. And in fact, what we found is participants tend to overweight the high frequency stimulus in this case. And maybe it's consistent with what your suggestion is that it's so even though like we are doing integration, but still maybe we have more attention to this more striking high frequency stimulus, so that we give more weights to the stimuli, right? So that's so maybe in daily life when we are faced of different kind of objects or events around us, then maybe our time perception, although it's kind of weighted average, but we give more weights to the more salient and more important events. So that's my guess.
Yeah. I think yeah, that answered my question. So yeah, you can. Yeah, anybody can ask questions.
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
Let me turn on the video. Oh, hi. Yeah. Thank you very much for the talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's kind of refreshing to listen to a talk on time perception. Since I've been very much interested in time, but then I haven't had much chance to work on it myself lately. And I had a couple of questions. So one is like when you do this kind of Bayesian modeling, it was I understand it's very powerful for sort of comparing different hypotheses, but I wonder whether you can, or whether you sort of incorporated individual differences. So I think people may have different strategies, or people may be susceptible to different aspects of stimuli. And like if you could sort of so in your model, did you have that kind of factor?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. So I guess for this kind of perception study, we often try to come up with a kind of coherent story, right? So we hope that there's one single mechanism that in general works better for all the participants. But indeed, I think if you look at individual participants, there may be some, if I remember correctly, there was some participants that maybe slightly actually better predicted by the random selection model. But on average, you see more participants better explained by the best model. And I think what you're pointing to is a very interesting direction when we start to think about computational psychiatry, right? Because
exactly, that's why I asked.
Yeah. So that's actually my lab is quite interested in is does the brain use different mechanism when it learns values, or when it learns structure of the environment, or maybe the different people use the same mechanism, but they only differ in some parameters in these learning models. And then can this kind of usage of the model in participants predict their maybe psychiatry symptoms. And this is something that we are very interested in exploring in the next stage.
Oh, okay. Oh, that sounds great. And yeah, another question I had was somewhat more general. So yeah, I don't know if you are working on time these days, but what do you think is the next big question in this area? It's a very broad question, but I just want to hear your opinion.
I think it's a quite also a really difficult question. I think I would say I think in some sense maybe an interesting question is how we kind of perform. It's not directly kind of time perception, but time travel, right? I think it's a very important question related to consciousness, which I mean when you are in daily life, you actually very often can bring your mind away from your current stage and think about either future or past, and you can easily navigate between them. And then what's the mechanism of how we switch between thinking about events at different time? And while we think of that, we actually can still kind of know what occurred earlier and makes this plan. I think this is something I feel is quite interesting. Although it's not exactly time perception, I have to say, I agree. But I think if broadly, if I want to answer kind of question related to time, this would be something to me quite interesting.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you.
And I think that to that, I think one very interesting direction is to understand how kind of mind wandering happens in people, and if they can have some objective measurement of mind wandering.
But what? Yeah, and so do you think it's connected to consciousness? I kind of think like mind wandering or sort of like mental time travel kind of thing. Maybe potentially related to the functions of consciousness. And so.
I also think so too. But I work less on consciousness, so I'll be very interested to maybe discuss with you further offline on this direction.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Anyone also ask questions?
Can I ask a question?
Please. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you very much for your talk. It was quite impressive and interesting. So I just wonder if the first part of your talk and second part of your talk is kind of related in terms of the brain mechanisms. So the first one is kind of learning the statistics, right? And what the outcome is that kind of attractive effect. So you can that the perceived duration or the time intervals can be attracted to the prior. But the second talk is more about like repulsive effect, right? So once you learn the time interval between the key place and your action and flash, then the stimulus that you perceive later becomes goes far away from the adapted one. So these two phenomena sounds quite a bit different, but I just wonder if you see any connection in terms of the brain mechanisms.
I think it's possible that you can also similarly build a Bayesian model for recalibration. And I don't recall the detail, but I think Wijima in collaboration with I forget the labs, but I think they also work on some Bayesian model for sensory calibration between vestibular perception and I think the visual perception. So that I think there indeed are works in this direction to apply Bayesian models to quantify this recalibration. But I think I indeed kind of thought of for a while for the second phenomenon, how I can build a Bayesian model for that, but I didn't continue on that direction. So, but yeah, I think it could be very interesting to think about this.
Yeah. Okay. So are you working on the neuroscientific studies or like brain imaging or? Yeah, I'm doing a lot of work on that kind of things and with field intervals, and I'm now working on empty interval with neuroimaging technique. But
yeah. So unfortunately, recently I switched my attention a little bit away from time perception, so I'm not actually working on neuroimaging, but I'm very looking forward to your result.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it would be great if we could have more discussion on this topic.
Yeah, I'm very happy to keep in touch. Feel free to email me.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, anyone, maybe from Slido? No one yet? Yeah, actually, I have some questions too. Yeah, so so you mentioned like the second part for the like after fading after effect. I was wondering like modality differences, like if you try with the flash or like a sound, is there like this shift differences between two? Maybe the modality which comes first is maybe affecting.
Yeah, this is a very nice question. So in fact, in the Stetson paper that I cited, they actually did test this, and it was very interesting that this phenomenon was much stronger when you adapt between your motor action and a particular sensory domain. But if you try to adapt between, say, visual and auditory, the phenomenon exists, but it's of much smaller magnitude. So I think this particular aspect might not be explained by my neural model, right? So why? Because it should be equivalent for different modality. And so why that the involvement of voluntary motion plays a much stronger role in this adaptation? I think that's also kind of worth asking. I think, yeah. But yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's good. Thank you very much. I have to look into that. And another point, like you mentioned, like in the dark room, like maybe our perception could be different. So if that means like nighttime, do we feel time longer, or?
Yeah, I guess maybe it's just like not necessarily. Oh, that's interesting. I see, because because the stimuli. I think that's possible, right? It's just I guess the problem is it's hard to do this. I think it could be interesting. Like you could judge duration between visual and auditory stimuli at different luminance level, and then and you can. I think that could be very interesting to do. Yes,
Yeah.
and you have to have a kind of third standard to make this comparison.
Right. Because I often like stay longer in nighttime actually, and then try to. And I feel a little bit longer in the nighttime, but yeah, so that's why like I ask question. Thank you.
I guess maybe it's not only kind of. I guess when I mentioned the darkness, it was more like our perception of an event is more delayed if we are in a darker environment.
Right.
But I think on the other hand, there was indeed like findings that the luminance or contrast of stimulus versus background can also influence your subject time. So who knows? Maybe this has been done. I'm sorry that I haven't checked whether the question has been answered. Like when you are in pure dark environment versus when you're in the bright environment, does your subject feeling of visual stimulus less like difference compared to the auditory stimulus? That could be very interesting question.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, another one, like I think Yoda a little bit asked the maybe the in terms of like computational psychiatry, this kind of the individual difference could be very interesting. I was wondering, I haven't seen much this kind of the time perception or some studies that often used in computational psychiatry to see the differences between like some patient and normal subject. Do you have any examples? Like
so I don't remember exactly detail, but I think Peter Hager indeed maybe worked a little bit on this on schizophrenia. But I'm sorry, I couldn't remember exactly the paper that came out. But I remember hearing him talk.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Like I'll check it out. So that's very interesting. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, anyone can ask questions, or I mean, in general, questions should be fine. Like maybe like how the environment in his institute, or I think we still have time. So yeah. Okay. Yeah, I have a lot of questions about institute too. So,
please go ahead if you have questions.
yeah. So thank you. So, yeah. So, do your institute take a PhD student? I would like to, like robotize. Seems a very good institute, like as far as my friends told me. So.
Yeah, so thank you. It's a very, very important question, which I also hope that I have a one way of answering. But so I think as of now, so our institute is still primarily focused on research. So we currently don't grant degree, which is slightly unfortunate. But we are having internal discussion of how plausible it is. And personally, I would really wish we could have a master or PhD program, but of course, it has to be a kind of joint decision. So currently, I think we couldn't. But many labs in the institute have positions either at a postdoc level or at a research assistant level. So if we definitely welcome local and international students who are interested to working with us to look at our website and look at kind of what career opportunity are available for you. Unfortunately, maybe we don't. Our center does not grant a degree, but I think some of our faculty members who are also affiliated with other departments of UTokyo, then potentially they can take students. So, and that might be one potential possibility for students who might be interested in pursuing some degrees.
Yeah. Okay. So students supposed to contact one by one the faculty. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's good.
Thank you for passing this message to
yeah. Because like this is a I think great opportunities for the student nowadays. Like you cannot go out often as before. So I think this international environment, like you're also there. So we should have a more tight connections, like utilize this tight connections.
Yeah. And I think our center really strive to try to make it more as international as possible. So both the PIs and all the members are from many different countries, and the working language is definitely English. So international applicants should feel free to apply, and we also encourage local Japanese students to actually have more interaction with us.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. How often like Japanese students contact you? Do you have a lot of like contact?
This is an interesting question. I also want to try to figure out. I think I mean we talked about Yuma, who's I had a very nice Japanese students working in my lab in the summer, and he was very productive and very impressed. But it seems interesting. I'm more often contacted by international students than Japanese students. But I don't know exactly why. I hope I can figure out the reason.
Right. Yeah, I think this institute sells. I don't know how much this I can say advertise or like that seems similar things happened to my previous institute. I was in OIST, Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology. That place like more often. People outside of Japan contact to the institute, and but Japanese students don't like apply to us. Like maybe one problem is English environment, and another point would be like the PhD is also not so attractive to the Japanese student nowadays. So, but
sad, but I wish it can be changed.
Yeah. But definitely, like there are some institutes like IRCN or OIST and DCAN. Some places have a great, nice lectures. So I think we should. I definitely want to advertise this kind of good environment to others.
And we wish we can make it a better environment for both local and international students.
Yeah,
so if you have any suggestion,
let me try to do that. Like now, because I do this event like regularly in English. I have some followers in Twitter, and those are mostly Japanese students. But I don't know, they are quite interested in consciousness, but yeah, my baby English problems.
Yeah, I think I hope I don't scare away students. So you don't have to be super good at English, right? So, as long as you can roughly understand what it means.
right. Yeah,
So,
that's the point.
And we hope we can also give a good environment for local students to actually practice English. And
Right. Yeah, I also want to give the opportunity. Yeah, so sorry everybody. Like, if you have any questions, please also cut in. Because we now just lovely chatting. So, and do you have any like collaboration with international collaboration nowadays, or?
Yeah. So I think so. I still have one collaboration with Yaniv Lab.
Okay.
So we are interested in, and so like basically two projects that still we're in touch. One is we're interested in how people learn the environment. Right? So for example, in this left task that we show that somehow people can learn this generative model and learn this cry. But I think it's true that in many of the perception study we assume that brain somehow learn this generative model, and we show that very often we can use this generative model. But very important question is how does this model come about, and how do we learn that? So we are so in one task it's a small kind of reward learning task, but we make the task such that it's important for participants to learn the rule that can give rise to reward. And so we try to build models to describe how participants actually learn these rules, which is in one form of generative model, if I call it. Yeah, I'm also collaborating on the projects on fMRI analysis tools. So and I'm also happy to form new collaborations with you and with others.
Oh, right.
I think maybe there's some chats. Okay.
Yeah, it's from Ryota. Like he's
Thank you so much for.
So okay, yeah. Right. Yeah. Actually, we are also thinking to invite some people from US and or if possibly China or Australia, because Australia and China is especially like a similar time zone, so we can get more the participants within those ranges because it's not that time difference is large. So, do you have any suggestion who are working on consciousness study? Because I very kind of a little bit new to this field, so
Yeah. I guess to me it was something like I have been very interested in consciousness, and I actually also attended one conference of it's called Association of Scientific Study of Consciousness, which was quite impressive, and I think that's where I actually met Ryota once. Myself has been kind of a little bit afraid to touch a field, because sometimes I feel it's really hard to field to tackle. But so I guess I don't have very good suggestion, but I'm actually more willing to learn from your club and to learn the state of art.
I see. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah. So yeah, I think
I'm very happy that I can be involved in this club.
Yeah. That'd be great. I mean, we currently like do rank online, but in offline, maybe we can just chat and talk more often, because we are in Tokyo. So yeah. Okay. Right. So. Okay. Yep. One can also ask. Okay. Yeah, and then what about like research environment in Japan? I mean the IRCN, or do you?
I think it seems in general nice. But I think there's more also things that I need to adapt to.
Yeah. I think I think most of the documental work done in Japanese, maybe it's very hard
Yeah.
Sometime, I think.
Yeah, I think sometimes I rely quite a lot on Google Translation to figure out what's the meaning. It's very interesting challenge. I'm also learning Japanese. It's quite fun.
Okay.
But also, I'm quite curious how. I guess if we're allowed to have kind of more lateral chat, I'm not sure if this is broadcasted.
Right. So yeah. Okay. Maybe we can stop the YouTube part and we can a little bit more chat. Yeah. Thank you very much. Let me a little bit talk about our next conscious club. I think next talk would be also interesting to the people too. So let me share. Okay, so yeah, thank you very much everyone for coming tonight, and thank the Minbos for the great talk. Okay, so yeah, next time we are going to have the talk from Makiko Yamada. She's in the Quantum Institute of Science and Technology in Chiba. So she has been working on like metacognition, like superiority illusions, and also some related works on metacognition and neuroimaging. So I think this is also quite relevant to how the consciousness benefit us. So yeah, please check it out. I'll post the title and abstract as soon as I got the information from her. Okay, thank you very much.